We were just finishing off talking about Michelle Alexander's idea of the new Jim Crow. So she's pointing out that in this era of colorblind racism or colorblindness, where we can no longer by law have discrimination against people based on their race or ethnicity thanks to civil rights laws, one way that we continue to have institutionalized racism is through imprisoning Black people at disproportionately high rates. So when we say disproportionate, usually we're talking about how their percentage in our population does not align with how many of them are behind bars. So she's pointing out that once you're labeled a felon, all the old forms of Jim Crow discrimination in employment, housing, disenfranchisement, denial of educational opportunities, access to food stamps, public housing, all of that becomes restricted. And so you can begin to understand how recidivism rates are very high, which is the rate of going back into the prison system once you're out, precisely because re entry into society becomes so difficult, right? Imagine if you're just out. First of all, the impact of institutionalization at the deep psychological level is very real. And on top of that, now you are thinking about how would you adjust back if you have no job, you don't have a place to live, you don't even have access to food stamps, right? And so people sometimes don't know that wages can be used to pay costs of imprisonments. There are a bunch of fines and fees that sometimes folks who were incarcerated or families of people who were incarcerated are paying, right? Solutions have to be multi-pronged, but we can start off um, by thinking about where to begin, right? Of course, this is going to be especially hard now because we know that so many folks are dependent on the prison industrial complex for jobs, right? Especially in rural communities where these private prisons are built. It's deeply entrenched in our political, economic, social system, but we do see a new human rights movement that is starting that's talking about education, jobs, shelter, and many folks are talking about schools in prison or giving prisoners the opportunity to earn their associate's degrees. In our social justice program, we partner with a community organization, Safe Return Richmond, and this is Tamisha Walker, who is now running for the Antioch City Council. It was her organization, Safe Return, was integral to Contra Costa County withdrawing a proposed jail expansion and dedicating 5 million to transitional housing, employment, integrated services, and bail reform. There are leaders, community leaders on the ground constantly working on this. At DVC, we have our own student club, which is called Scholars for Justice. For any of you who might be interested, please do get in touch with me. I will link you up with them. Scholars for Justice is made up of formerly incarcerated students or system impacted students. And they precisely work on this idea of not only supporting each other, because these are very highly stigmatized identities, but also creating that pathway to university. And so there are lots of programs, funding available to make that happen. So we arrive at our topic of the school to prison pipeline. And what you find is that, so we think of the school to prison pipeline is constituted of policies that encourage the police as discipline in charge or literally bouncers at school. Some schools have metal detectors installed. So it's almost like we are socializing our children to go into the prison system. These bouncers use really harsh tactics, some of which has more recently been caught on video, and including physical restraint, lots of suspensions. The more time you spend out of the classroom, the more likely you are to drop out of school because you're missing a lot of the material, you're not able to be successful in the class, and therefore you drop out. But the problem is even more complex than that. So if you have zero tolerance policies, the teachers decide to refer students for punishment, and once they're pushed out of that classroom, they're more and more likely to be introduced into the criminal justice system. Who is in the pipeline? Again, disproportionately, it is racial minorities and children with disabilities. Right? Black children constitute 18% of the students in population, but they account for 46% of the suspensions, and about 1 in 4 Black children with disabilities are suspended at least once, versus 1 in 11 white students with disabilities. So we're already seeing disabled students going through this a lot, but disproportionately, again, Black disabled children. Here's a really important graphic that you see of who are these children who are being pushed into the prison system. 40% of students expelled from US schools each year are Black. 70% of students involved in in-school arrests or referred to law enforcement are Black or Latino. Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than whites, and Black and Latinx students are twice as likely not to graduate. So as you're seeing this strong relationship between these variables, but you're also seeing that 70% of these inmates in California State Prison were former foster care youth, which means we're really abandoning these folks once they are out of the foster care system. And then 68% of all males in state and federal prison do not have a high school diploma. And yet, as a society, we keep investing in more private prisons rather than in building more institutions of education, higher education, and so on. Even though we know that rates of recidivism almost drop to zero once a person who's imprisoned has the opportunity to earn an AA. There are some clear measures offered to avoid the school to prison pipeline, including the increase of the use of positive behavior interventions. Some schools have adopted this, where you can't any longer suspend folks, but you have to send them to a listening circle, to restorative justice kinds of processes, right? And data collection on this becomes really important. Who's disciplined? Which are the students that are pushed out? Creating agreements between schools and police departments, and so on and so forth. Training teachers about de-escalation, how to find alternative methods rather than just getting the help of a bouncer, right? But some folks have taken a step further. They want the police out of our schools. At least 2/3 of American high schools high school students attend a school with a police officer. 2/3. Oakland School Board recently voted unanimously to abolish the Oakland Unified School District Police Department. The resolution was drafted by the community-led organization Black Organizing Project. It abolishes the Oakland Unified School District Police Force of 10 sworn officers and 50 unarmed campus safety officers. It calls on the superintendent to reallocate the funds, which was $2.5 million, right, to support services such as social workers, psychologists, restorative justice practitioners, and so on. And so this is not just limited to Oakland, but now it's a nationwide movement that's asking for the abolition of the police force. Which is why I'm saying you folks should do your research in unpacking that and seeing how this is being recommended. I recommend this website, 82abolition.com, which lines out 8 different points of what that means. And it's been interpreted differently in different parts, but kind of the gist of it, the commonality is this ask of resetting public safety in order to eliminate over-reliance on law enforcement, discrimination, and avoidable harm in public safety, including, of course, unnecessary police killings. And of course, this doesn't mean that when you call 911, no one shows up, right? It means that the right person will respond with the right skill set, the tools you need. You already have this with fire departments and the EMS, right? And I like this quote from UCLA professor here. The current administration uses fear to alienate communities, exacerbate racial hostilities, pass dangerously inequitable policy. Now's the time for hope and courage. We have to hold both major parties and their candidates for president accountable on this issue. Progress has never been achieved without an uncomfortable struggle, and Black Americans have been lethally struggling with our criminal legal system since its inception, right? So historically, this has always been the case. It's not new, it's just new on our phone cameras.